thank you so much for being here. As she said, I'm a religion reporter at the Washington Post, and I have the pleasure of speaking today with Ambassador Akbar Ahmed. He's the chair of Islamic Studies at American University. His biography is very long. It would take me a long time to explain everything he's done, but he also is chair of the Middle East and Islamic Studies at the U.S. Naval Academy and is a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. He has come out recently, which is why we're here today, just this summer, with an amazingly timed book. It's helping us through this period of discussion about Islam in America. The book is called Journey into America, The Challenge of Islam. For those of you who aren't familiar with the details of the book, it is part anthropological, part travelogue. He and his team traveled from the fall of 2008 to 2009 around the country and visited about 75 cities, and I think over 100 of the approximately 1,200, although I think some people believe there's more mosques even than that today. So one of the things that I was interested in as a religion reporter is this project that you undertook, and the lack of this kind of information underscores the sort of dearth of information, very solid information about American Muslims. A byproduct, it seems to me, is that at a time like this summer, when we have so much public discussion about Islam, that it calls for people to speak on behalf of the American Muslim community. So I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about that, if that's a pressing issue. Who speaks for this very diverse community, and how is that being answered?
Well, Michelle, this question, who speaks for Islam, is something that I raised when several years back I was asked by Brookings to conduct a project in the Muslim world. And I was very interested in exploring the whole idea of Muslim leadership, which has always fascinated me. I've been writing about it for decades. But about 5-6 years back, I went to the Muslim world with my members of my team. Some of them are here. Jonathan is here. Frank is here. We went to the Middle East, South Asia, Far East Asia, precisely to try to answer this question. When we got back, I assumed, like many people, that there was a leadership structure in place in America. After all, this is a very advanced society. It's a democratic society. So one assumed that a leadership had grown organically and was in place. And we saw various organizations, ISNA, CARE, ICNA, and so on, very active in the public square. But when we undertook this study and the field trip, we very quickly realized that there were divisions in the community, in the Muslim community, divisions based on ethnicity, on sect, on regional background. So there were Muslim immigrants from the Middle East or South Asia, and within that, national differences. So while Pakistanis and Bangladeshis may have a lot in common, they may go to the same mosque, nonetheless, although at one stage they were the same people, same country, there have been developments which have moved them apart. Then within the countries, the differences between, say, Punjabis or Pathans are also in a sense carried over into America, certainly with the older generation. It's just different with the younger generation. Now when you put all this together in terms of a tiny community, 2% or 6-7 million in number in America, you discover that it does not present a very coherent leadership. So while you would assume that it's a tiny community, it's going to produce a dozen or 2 dozen really coherent, sharp, wise, intelligent leaders who can guide the community, you on the ground discover that in fact the community is riven with these different features which do not lend to unity, easily to unity. And then in a time of great change that we are seeing in America, a time of tension, of crisis, that is the backdrop, not only for Muslims. It is a time of great uncertainty and change for all Americans, white or non-white, Muslim or non-Muslim, issues of the economy, issues of the interminable wars overseas, the immigration issues, the first time that we have a non-white president in the White House. All these are causing a lot of anguish and soul-searching and debate and controversy. And then the role of Islam. So when you put this in the background and you have a tiny community which has not really thrown up that kind of leadership that a community needs and requires, you suddenly realize the enormity of the challenge the community faces. And we saw this, that on the ground we met many imams, especially African American imams, very impressive, very impressive. These are wise, compassionate leaders, but they are really restricted to the community. The next mosque may have a very different kind of leadership. Many of the imams in many mosques created the question in my mind as to how well connected they were with local people. So if you're a Muslim teenager and you had problems you wanted to ask, a lot of young people asking questions about the boundaries around Islam, and the issues that concern them are dating, drugs, drinking, the 4 Ds as the young Muslims call it. Who do they talk to? In Muslim culture, the relationship between parents and the young generation is not as free as it is in most American homes. So they may then want to talk to the local imam, priest, the local Muslim priest. And if the local priest happens to be from Egypt or Bangladesh or Pakistan, they're coming from a very different culture. And they will not be able to satisfy the young American teenager quite easily or fluently. And therefore, the teenager then is left floundering for answers. And that is why some of them, a very tiny number, may then just go on the internet and get in touch with people overseas. So we did see that these are problems that are out there and they're simmering. And our job as scholars, as researchers, was really to capture what anthropologists call it, take a snapshot of a society at that moment in time. And we need many more studies like this. We need many more studies like this of not only the Muslim community, but the Muslim community in the context of American society today, living in the North, in the South, in the East and the West, and then cross-cultural comparisons of these societies.
And so if you had to predict, that's what we're always trying to do in journalism, say something that 10 years from now will seem like, prescient. So if you had to guess where this discussion about leadership is going, are there particular issues that you think, obviously people are coalescing around this, sort of outcry of criticism and prejudice against Islam. I mean, where is this going? Are there particular issues? Are there particular people or particular ways that you think this is going to, if we were looking again down the road to see where is the leadership going to come from?
I think if you're looking down the road, this question relates to the context within which we need to look at the problem. And the context really is what is happening in America today. So while we think we are talking of the Muslim community, and we are on one level, we are really discussing American identity. What does it mean to be an American? And unless that question is resolved and answered, you cannot answer the first question about Muslims. You cannot resolve the issues around a tiny minority until the majority that is concerned about the minority is satisfied in terms of its own identity. And because America right now is going through this period of intense debate about its own identity, it'll probably be a couple of years before it can be completely at ease with the question of being American. Now, to us, and I'm not a scholar of American history, I realize that unless I read up on American history and American culture and society, I would not be able to write a valid book on America. So I began a very intense period of reading. I got my team, the young team, to read everything on the subject. So we spent a whole summer reading everything, literature, culture, history, and going right back to the roots of American society and American history. And we learned many things that inspired us. One of the things that inspired us, and a lot of Americans would benefit from this knowledge, was the attitude of the founding fathers to other religions, to the notion of religious pluralism, which is what America is all about. This is what makes America America. This genuine sense of religious pluralism. We discovered, for example, that John Adams called the Prophet of Islam one of the greatest truth seekers of history, up there with Socrates and Confucius. That Benjamin Franklin called him a model of compassion. That Jefferson owned a copy of the Quran, and we all know that famously now, and hosted the first iftar at the White House. That Washington reached out to Muslims, specifically mentioned the name Islam for immigrant communities that are welcome in America. And Jefferson has this remarkable statue outside the University of Virginia with an angel holding a tablet which says religious freedom, 1786, with the names of God, for the Christian God, Jehovah, Jewish God, Allah, Muslim God. Muslims believe they're all the same. But just think of a situation where in the late 18th century you have this extraordinary group of people visualizing a society that would welcome not only Jews, and remember this is basically a Christian society at that stage in time, but welcoming Jews but also Muslims, and then even more astounding, beyond that they had Atma and Brahma, that is including Hinduism. I applaud that vision because we are talking of the 18th century. And yet in the 21st century, those same Americans descended from these founding fathers with that same vision. That is the vision of America after all. That is what forms the Declaration and the US Constitution. They are talking about the same religion, Islam, threatening to burn the same Quran that is owned by Jefferson, demonizing the Prophet of Islam as a terrorist, a pedophile, and all kinds of vile and foul language. And I ask myself, what has happened to America? I don't ask Americans to love or respect or revere Islam. I ask them to respect religious pluralism, which is what being American is all about. So it really is a question of American identity, where America is going with its own notion of self. And unless that is resolved, we will have a problem with Muslims. Now the problem is that a lot of Muslims we found in the field were not so conscious of American culture and history. So they were not aware that they were also being caught up in these great historical debates which America has every half a century or a century. Last America had this very intense debate with itself in the 60s and 70s around the civil rights movement, and you saw that it was so intense. Presidents were shot, and Martin Luther King Jr. lost his life, and Malcolm X was assassinated, and so on. It was all part of this debate about what does it mean to be American. The previous century we had the country tearing itself apart with the Civil War. Again, a question of what is America to be. And I think we're just entering another phase of American history where American identity is being very intensely debated. And in that context, to predict any kind of pattern for Muslim leadership would really be foolhardy, because we really can't imagine what kind of leadership would emerge. We already have some very talented people speaking on behalf of the Muslims and also being Muslims themselves. We talked to people like Ibu Patel and so many other young Muslims. But a lot of members of the community would say that this individual or that individual doesn't belong to my sect or my community, and not easily accept them. So the notion of an easy Muslim leadership emerging has not really, I think, taken hold even today in this time of crisis.
Do you think that that's one of the most, I mean, I raised that issue, but I don't know if you think that's one of the most important things. I mean, I saw the piece that you wrote in Foreign Policy, which laid out some of what you found in the book, and you paint a picture of, you know, like in a sense, an urgency. That's how I read it. Not just in terms of how, you know, the fear and prejudice that you describe, hearing American Muslims describe from the outside, but also from the inside. I mean, people being wary of talking to your team, people seeing sort of, you know, enemies everywhere. I mean, like a community that has a lot of issues. So I wanted to know if do you think that I'm depicting that right, and what would you say are the most important internal issues?
I would say, Michelle, that we need to be very fair about the Muslim community. One of the characteristics we found both here and in the Muslim world is the characteristic of hospitality. Muslims, by definition, are very hospitable. It's part of Muslim culture. It's part of Muslim theology. And it goes back to Abraham. Abraham, if you recall from our religious shared history and tradition, left one part of his tent open, and that was for the stranger. Now that's something we've inherited as part of the Abrahamic tradition. So we found throughout this trip, Muslims were constantly hospitable. Our problem very often was we were being pulled in 2 or 3 directions the same evening. That's what we were, everywhere we went. At the same time, we were aware that Muslims and the community are living through extraordinary times of pressure. They may have wanted to be minimizing that kind of fear and tension around them, but we were scholars looking for hints and clues. So for example, we'd see a mosque, maybe a window broken, maybe something smashed, maybe some graffiti. In one case in Colombia, a mosque firebombed in Tennessee. Now this is before the controversy which has now erupted around this other mosque, the Murfreesboro Mosque. We saw that. Our team went down and interviewed the people running that mosque. The mosque had been firebombed. The Muslims told to go home. And the Muslims said, we are home. Some of them were white converts. Some kids had been born here in America. And they said, where do we go? This is our home. And then the other aspect of American culture and American character, where the Reverend Williamson, the heroic Reverend Williamson, the Presbyterian pastor, turns up with the keys to his church and says, use my church, come and use it as a mosque, come and pray in my church until you find your own house of worship. So we saw a community under that kind of pressure, not very certain, not very sure of its leadership. In some mosques we saw the imam being openly challenged. In some mosques we saw the imam secure, confident. In some we saw the imam transferred or his services terminated abruptly. We asked questions, why was this happening? As again an anthropologist, I'm concerned with cause and effect. If this happens, then this will happen. Those are the laws of society. And although some may doubt this, Michelle, we anthropologists believe that we are a social science. So there is some element of logic to the subject. And if you begin to then add all these different bits and pieces, you get a fairly coherent picture of society. A society which on the whole is going through a phase of uncertainty, fear, in parts even paranoia, is worried and concerned about the future. The leadership, spotty, it's there in one place, not there in another place, challenged in its own community, challenged outside. The very religion sometimes brutally mocked in public, in the media, and a community helpless to answer. How does it answer when the God of Islam, or the Holy Prophet of Islam, who's the most respected and revered figure in Islam, is mocked in public? What do they do? This is a society that values rightly and correctly freedom. But does freedom mean that Islam is singled out and mocked and ridiculed? We don't see this happening of the Jewish faith or the Catholics or the other communities or the Hindus or the Buddhists. It seems that Islam is constantly at the receiving end of this kind of ridicule and humiliation, and people can get away with it. You hear all kinds of nonsense about Islam and no one seems to bother about it. So this does have an effect on an individual who may believe we are in a free society, all of us have the same rights, but then becomes aware that somehow a Muslim is being singled out for that particular wrath or ridicule. And that of course creates a lot of heartburning.
And you mentioned in the book sort of your way of sketching out the different schools of, I don't know if you said schools of mosque, schools, sort of philosophical and theological schools. Do you feel like you could talk a little bit about those schools?
Yes, because very often we are asked, you know, this is a radical mosque, this is a mosque inclined towards terrorism and so on, and that makes no sense to me, because a mosque basically is just bricks and mortar and cement. It's a building. It's the people inside the mosque that determine which way it's going to be going, particularly the imam, with the board, the elders of that mosque. And we found, and again this reflects our findings in the Muslim world, that if you divided them into 3 broad categories, as you divided Muslim society into the mystics, into the modernists and the literalists, you'll have a clearer idea of how each of these 3 groups is responding to society around them. Now, I'll hastily add that these aren't watertight categories, that there's a great deal of overlap, that these are very crude categories, simply allowing us to visualize, to conceptualize a very complex and diverse society, because the entire Muslim world is here. You have Muslims from the whole Muslim world. We met Muslims from Cambodia and Muslims from Afghanistan and Turkey, the whole Muslim world. So how do you make sense of that? Now, if you did this, if you had these three broad categories, it immediately begins to make sense that a mystic, for example, a mystic mosque would be emphasizing universal humanism. So, for example, in the mystic mosque in New York, and we give examples of this, we saw, I would say something like, what, 20–30% of the people there were Jews. You know, they were completely at home. They were there, they sat down, we all chanted the wondrous names of God, and there was a wonderful atmosphere of a universal brotherhood, if you like. The imam that evening was a female, a Muslim convert. Then there are mosques which are modernist mosques. They're conscious of being Muslims. They're also conscious of being American. They're conscious that this is a mosque. We come here, we say our prayers, we elevate ourselves spiritually, and we go home. Our aim is not to disrupt or blow up things or to be violent. They're also conscious of the media and the demands of the media, a modernist mosque. Then there are the literalist mosques. Now, the literalist mosque would want to worship, basically. Their aim is to be left alone to their own faith, to their own prayers. And they also believe, a lot of them, that Islam is under attack. Islam is being attacked, and Islam is being constantly harassed and humiliated, and we Muslims as a community, as a faith, must stand up and defend our faith. Now, not all of them by any means would want to be aggressive or even violent, but some of them would be so angry or motivated that they would in their response and in their rebuke of this attack or this counter-attack would suggest that we will be as aggressive as the people attacking us. And here you have the danger that you have three different categories. The danger is, of course, if people looking at the Muslim community say, this is a monolith, the Muslim world is a monolith, they're all alike. And a lot of the so-called experts on Islam create exactly that, a monolith. Now this is absurd, because Muslims constitute something like 1/4 of the human world's population, 1 out of 4 people. And there's such a variety of people, even these three categories, such a crude, inadequate categorization. And to consider them as a monolith makes no sense at all. And yet people do that. So people are saying all Muslims are like. Sometimes they'll tell me, where are the moderates? There are no moderates in Islam. Why don't the moderates speak up? Now they're saying this to me 10 years after 9/11. And I give them examples of Pakistan, where I come from originally, which is now going through this intense period of almost self-destruction in its own soul-searching, where Muslims are killing Muslims. And yet in Pakistan, 30,000 Pakistanis have died after 9/11 as a backlash of 9/11, the American invasion of Afghanistan, the backlash, the Taliban coming into the tribal areas, at one point taking over Swat. And in that effort to regain the state, 30,000 Pakistanis have lost their lives. My wife comes from Swat. Several of her first cousins have been killed in this battle against the Taliban to re-establish modern Islam, which is what their family believed in. Benazir Bhutto, the most popular leader of Pakistan, representing a democratic party. Now, I don't want to advocate her politics or her goodness as a politician or not. I'm simply talking of her as a symbol of democracy, someone who believed in democracy rather than another form of government. Now, she went back to Pakistan. She went back knowing that there would be serious attempts on her life. She could have sat it out in Cannes or Paris or London and been a world celebrity and enjoyed her life. She went back knowing that her life was in danger and gave her life to further the cause of democracy. So when someone tells me there's no moderate in Islam and moderates, and there's no such thing as a moderate, and the Muslim world is just lying on its back with violence and turmoil completely taking over, that is just not correct. It's not historically correct. So again, if you see the mosques here and the community here, a similar kind of debate, a similar kind of tussle is taking place in the community.
Maybe you could, if we have a few more minutes, how close are we to?
We're good.
We're doing good? Okay. Just to go into that in a little more detail, you were saying one of the issues that I know that you wrote about and also the book includes a questionnaire, was trying to engage people about the question of democracy. So was there anything that you found notable in there? I mean, I know you mentioned here and there that some people, that word is, you know, loaded for some people. I mean, is that an important discussion? And then
I think again, Michelle, I would correlate it to the three categories. For the mystics, I mean, put yourself in the shoes. If you're a mystic Muslim, you're more interested in trying to reach God, and along your journey, whether someone next to you is a Jew or a Christian, like the great Rumi. We are sitting in the Rumi Forum. One of the greatest mystics of all time is Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi. We all love him, we revere him. Now, his followers included Jews and Christians and people of no faith, because they saw in him a man advocating love and universal compassion. So your priorities would be different. You may be involved in democracy, you may not be involved in democracy. You may be living on a different plane, as a lot of these mystics do. Rumi himself was offered all kinds of honors and titles which he didn't accept. Then you come to the modernist. Now the modernist has no problem with democracy, because modernism means the modernist Muslim wants democracy. Pakistan, going back to Pakistan, was created by Muhammad Ali Jinnah. The founder of Pakistan represented modern democracy. His idea was a democracy which would balance tradition and modernity. Women's rights, minority rights, the law, the rule of law, upholding the constitution. This is what Jinnah visualized for Pakistan. Then you have the literalists. Now the literalists may say, we want our lives to approximate as closely as possible, as literally as possible, to the time of the Holy Prophet of Islam in the 7th century. And there you have a problem, because physically today it's very difficult to approximate to the 7th century without creating all kinds of problems in society. And that debate is taking place in Muslim society even today. And it's not a new debate. It's not a post 9/11 debate. It's a debate that began in the 19th century. And in America, you have exactly the same situation. So if you went to a mosque which is a literalist mosque, you may have a much more closer adherence to literalist Islam, meaning that people would be hoping, desiring to dress and behave as if they were in 7th century Arabia. In no way contradicting or challenging the rules or the structures of the contemporary state, but wanting to be left alone to worship in their own way. The modernist would have no problem. He'd want to be involved in local politics, want to be involved in the local media and so on.
I thought it was interesting that you went to mosques, which, I mean, it makes sense, obviously, but that's an institution that's in a lot of flux right now. And actually, I was in a mosque in Central Virginia last week, and the imam there was explaining explaining to people that it was election time, and he was trying to explain to them the importance of being a participant in the mosque and being voting and that kind of thing. And he was saying that even though it was a large, not new community, that's still a challenge. That for an imam, these other issues, that's more of a regular issue, is trying to get people involved in the board and that kind of thing. So anyway, I thought it was interesting that you picked mosques, because even though obviously it's a central place, it's a place that's in transition. A lot of people still just come and go from the mosque. So I was wondering if you talked about looking at other institutions, or if you found anything particular about picking
Michelle, because again, as an anthropologist, I want you to look at all of society. Society is a mosaic. A mosque is a very important part of the community. It's where people come to worship. It's where very often people just come to be after Friday prayers and talk, or some of the major issues of the community and so on. But it is just one institution. There's the family, which is critical. There's work. And we spent months and months with Muslim families. We followed Muslims to their homes. We spent time in their factories, in their offices and so on. And all this data put together allows you to create a picture of a community, and that's what we did. Again, it's far from perfect, it's far from adequate. I would say these studies need to really begin in earnest. This is just one shot, the opening shot, if you like. It itself was a major study in the sense that just to conduct this study meant I was traveling for 1 year in the field. We went to 75 cities, we went to 100 mosques. Now that is a lot of traveling, a lot of logistics. My team, luckily for me, was young American researchers. They had a lot of energy, but we were going round the clock. It was just non-stop, and I know that at times they put up with a lot of sacrifice, they put up with a lot of nonsense in travel. You know, the boys, 3 of them were in one room, the girls were in one room, and 1 night, 2 nights is fine, but after weeks and weeks of this, you become really, you know, you reach the point of, because every city you arrived in, early in the morning, we had to just hit the road, non-stop. Next morning, again, non-stop. So it was like that mythical character in one of our theological fables where the person works all night and creates a wall, and when he wakes up, the wall has tumbled down and he's got to start constructing it again in the morning. So that's exactly how we felt. It was just non-stop, going on and on. But the data was so rich and the responses were so enthusiastic. Again, I found the Muslim community very, very open, very hospitable, with all their problems and the uncertainties and even some of the neurosis that we could visibly see. Even then, they opened themselves, opened their hearts, and allowed us to take this snapshot of the community.
The questionnaire that you created was really interesting. So I don't know if I just picked a few questions, and he told me something that was, I thought, very helpful as a reporter, that a question you'd like to ask is about role models. When you try to, you know, ask people a specific question to get them talking as opposed to something general. So I thought that was, I wanted to just see if some of these questions triggered anything, if you remember. One of them was that question where you would ask people to name contemporary role models. Another was you asked people if they believed there was gender equality in Islam, and then you also asked people to describe what they thought the war on terror meant. So I wanted to just, or if there's other questions in there that you thought were interesting, that was just memorable, the type of stories you tell people when you relate stuff about your trips.
Well, Michelle, all this is of course in the book, but the role model question is important because I discovered long ago when I was doing fieldwork among the tribal peoples of Pakistan for my PhD, going back many decades, that in order, I mean, this is a challenge for all of us, for you as a journalist. How do you very quickly establish a rapport with an individual who doesn't really know you, so that that individual trusts you enough to open up, to really share what they are thinking about the world or about some particular subject. And I found that if you wanted to get to know someone very quickly and genuinely know someone, and if you ask them about their role models, it tells you a lot about the individual, and very quickly begins to tell you where that individual stands in the world. So if I asked you who are your role models and you said Hitler and Mao and Pol Pot, I know the kind of person you are. I'm sure you wouldn't say that, but you know, you would give yourself away. So when a lot of Muslims said to us, their role model was Thomas Jefferson, you know, it immediately told us a lot about that community. A lot of Muslims, not a lot of Muslims, almost all Muslims, both in America, and this, Michelle, I want you to listen to very carefully. Almost all Muslims in America and in the Muslim world, where we conducted a similar questionnaire, would say the #1 role model was the Holy Prophet of Islam. Now, if that is the case, if to 1.5 billion the Holy Prophet of Islam, rightly, wrongly, whatever non-Muslims consider this individual so revered and so loved that he is their role model, that you're going to try to imitate him, whether you're a woman or a man, whether you're a Turk or a Pakistani or a Bangladeshi or an Indonesian or an American, it doesn't make sense for America, which wants to win hearts and minds, to have other Americans abuse him and humiliate him and ridicule him. Because to a lot of people in the Muslim world, that will give the impression that Americans don't like us. That's how the world sees each other. So that's one of the things we learned through this whole business of asking about role models. We also learned some very strange role models, unlikely role models. In the Middle East, Oprah Winfrey came up a couple of times. You know, young Muslims, you know, they looked at Oprah Winfrey, she's one of the role models. Again and again, the Prophet coming up, the early Muslims, some of the heroic Muslims, the great names like Abu Bakr and Umar and Ali, they would come up. Contemporary names would come up. Contemporary names very often you have some of these pop singers, some of these young Muslims that cultural heroes that are emerging throughout the Muslim world, in the regions, in the Middle East, in South Asia. So it is a community, the Muslim community, very vital. It's alert, it's alive, it's aware of the world, it's watching the media, it's watching others watching it. So it's not all gloom doom. It's also a question of we are here to stay, this is our country. And I think taken aback by 9/11, taken aback because suddenly it's saying, why are Americans so suspicious of us? Why are Americans asking us these questions? Because we are Americans. And the big question, of course, is these are citizens. So why is America now suddenly looking at them as if though they're not citizens, but second-class citizens? That is the big question. And we have to ask this.
Well, I've always felt, I mean, in Washington, we're kind of wonky. Like, we tend to pay a lot of attention to people that, maybe people around the country don't. So I often kind of look on this beat when I write about Muslim Americans, that I'd be interested to see purely cultural figures, that, and I think that 10 years from now you'll see, as we talked about, sort of just the maturation of civic institutions and that kind of thing, that there will be cultural figures who are more well known than there are now. But it'd be interesting to hear who those people are. It's also a period, Michelle, if you look at history, as scholars of history, we are constantly looking at the past and comparing it to the present. When I look at the Muslim world, just 2 or 3 decades ago, I see these figures who, whether you like them or don't like them, or agree with them or not agree with them, these are huge figures with a large imprint. In the Muslim world, you had the 60s, you had President Ayub Khan, and you had King Faisal, and you had Ayatollah Khomeini, and earlier you had Nasser in Egypt. These are figures who are making an impact on the world. Further east, you had Sukarno. These are big names. And today, somehow Zardari or Karzai don't quite match up in terms of stature. Similarly in the West, half a century ago you had JFK, and you had these great figures in American history, and earlier you had Eisenhower, and you had some really extraordinary leaders, Roosevelt, and again today you have Bush, and now of course President Obama, very eloquent and a beautiful rhetoric, but not quite matching up to the early vision and expectations that everyone had of him. So there are also phases, I think, in human history where a leadership achieves a certain level, and sometimes you have a period of barrenness, a plateau, and I think the Muslim world is going through that particular period. So it's not just because part of the change that's going on is also in our communications culture, where everybody was watching, for example, we were talking about reading the same newspapers, so it might have been easier for certain figures to dominate because they had less options of people to look towards. But is that, or you think something else is going on?
There's no doubt about it. I know that I've been watching this and studying this, scandals, for example, because once constant scandals against or about political leaders tend to diminish them, and nothing can be hidden today. JFK was doing all kinds of things which the media deliberately shielded. Today, whether it's a Clinton or Edwards, immediately it's out there and everyone's talking about it, and for weeks and weeks till you destroy that politician. Similarly, in the Muslim world, till the 60s, all these great figures that, looking from outside, looked so great and secure, may not be as secure today with the intrusiveness of the media.
Is that, but when you said you feel like this is a barren period, what are some other reasons for that?
I think they also, the age we're living in, it's an age of impatience, it's an age of great uncertainty, it's an age where people seem to have no time for each other. Even in the Muslim world, families are falling apart, divorce is much more frequent, even in the Muslim world now. What we considered were Western ills, as it were, in society, they have now crept into society. Much less respect for elders, much more cynicism, much more materialism. We prided ourselves in the East constantly that the East is somehow more spiritual. This is one of the myths, one of the cliches of our civilizations, that the East is spiritual, inherently spiritual. And again, the kind of materialism you see there. Some of my friends have just come from Islamabad, Dr. Asad Shah and his wife Nigat, and we were talking about what's happening in Pakistan today. The elite, for example, There's a lot of money. The gap between the very rich and the very poor this gap is increasing, and the very rich lead lives which are in a cocoon, very materialistic lives, very lives which are really it's the la dolce vita for themselves, and they're quite indifferent to the suffering of the millions and millions of ordinary people. So we are also passing through that stage of history. Again, half a century ago, look at the leadership. We produce in the Muslim world, in Pakistan, we produce a man like Jinnah. This is a giant. In India, you had Gandhi, you had Nehru, you had Maulana Azad. These are all giants in their own way. These are extraordinary figures. Yet today, if I asked you who the Prime Minister of India was, you may not even be able to answer very easily, or the previous one, because they don't make that kind of mark. The kind of sacrifice that those earlier leaders gave, the sense of identity with the ordinary people, the capacity to stand up for principles, to really believe in their principles. There's a famous story of Jinnah, for example. Now equate him to some of the shenanigans that go on in modern politics. He's brought letters that passed between Nehru and Lady Mountbatten, which was sort of compromising because it was rumored they were having an affair. Jinnah's brought these letters and asked to publish them, and they would destroy the reputation of his opponent. And he is furious. He says, I do not indulge in this kind of politics. I will not achieve Pakistan on this basis. Now just think of any politician today doing that to an opponent. They would just destroy them. So there was also a sense of morality in politics, which I think has evaporated.
And one other thing that we spoke about, we're talking about challenges to the community from internal challenges, and one of the things you and I have discussed, which you hinted at before, you said something about the confusion, a word that you've used before, that when the Muslim world looks to our culture and they see U.S. government investing heavily in the Muslim world in some ways, and then they see these events in the public that they're trying to translate. So I wanted to see if you could elaborate a little bit more on, when you say you feel like there's this confusion, it sounds like you think that's an important thing, and I'm wondering how can that be sort of clarified? I mean, you're talking about a complicated culture we have, so I mean, we're not going to speak with one voice, all Americans.
You have a complicated culture, Michelle, like most modern cultures, they're very complicated, and especially a large country like the United States. But see, I'm talking about what I call the great American conundrum. So with the one hand, America is the most generous of friends to a country like Pakistan or Afghanistan or Egypt. Billions and billions of dollars given in aid. Billions of dollars. Where that goes, what happens to it is a separate issue. With the other hand, you have pastors wanting to burn the Quran, mosques are being attacked, mosques are being refused permission to build. Now, to the Muslim world, they're not distinguishing between government or an individual or the pastor who may as an individual be perfectly in his rights to do what he wants to do, burn any book he wants to burn. They're seeing a society that's coming to them and saying, we're your friends, we want to win hearts and minds in the Muslim world. And while wanting to win hearts and minds, some Americans are going to abuse your prophet, abuse your holy book, abuse your religion. And they are then confused. And they say, Americans are not serious, Americans are not sincere about being our friends. That is the confusion I'm talking about. A foreign policy needs to be based on clarity of vision, because it is crucial for America to have that clarity in terms of foreign policy. A foreign policy cannot have at its heart a contradiction, because if you have a contradiction, you have a confused foreign policy.
Well, how is that? Maybe we can go to questions? Let's go to questions. Do we need to have a microphone?
I'm a physician in Alexandria.
Did you say Dr. Osama?
Dr. Osama Mesh, a surgeon in private practice in Alexandria, Virginia. Dr. Akbar, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to hear you. Thank you, Michelle. The question I have is I think you put your hand on a very critical issue, I believe, early on in the talk and in your travels about the leadership within the Muslim community or the American Muslim community. And I think my question would be is, what would be the components that would constitute a qualified leadership for that audience? And that's what the question is, and I will highlight it with a couple of comments, because I think one of the things that we need to recognize is the fact that the community needs to be inspired by a unifying vision that takes it beyond the reality of it being a very diverse and potentially having these factors inherently work against that issue of unity. And I think until we are able to espouse a unifying vision for who we are as Americans, who we are as Muslims, and a degree of fusion that helps to define us as we envision a greater and a better America, and I think that's key. So to me, that's a component that has to come arguably from scholars, arguably from people who are have the ability to envision and reflect upon these issues. And the second is some degree of credibility in the history and in the involvement and the segments that are needed for it. But I'm more interested in your answer than the comments that I would make.
No, I agree, Doctor, that a community needs to have that kind of leadership, and that we have a problem because an ordinary Muslim living in his community has so many competing identities. You have, as I said, sectarian identities, and these matter to Muslims. Are you Shia? Are you Sunni? A lot of Muslims still, certainly of the older generation, still tend to be a little bit traditional. What is your region? Will you have your own? Classic example is in mosques, where very often we found the board of the mosque would be divided. If it was immigrants, you'd had a certain tension between South Asians and the Middle East, especially for leadership. There's always that kind of tension. And I'm hopeful that the young generation will transcend this, so that the young generation growing up here in the United States will respond to this problem in American terms. So for them, sect or original nationality is not going to make any difference as much as the capacity and the quality of leadership, to be able to provide answers, to be able to speak fluently. And I meet some very, very smart young men and women in the Muslim community, and I'm hopeful. The challenge, of course, is that while they're emerging, we may not have the luxury of so much time, because events are moving so fast. You're just beginning to start seeing this young generation emerge, and you have the crisis around the grounds, mosque, and you have the pastor, and you have something else, and this is constantly keeping the pot on the boil, which is making it very difficult. A new leadership emerging in normal times is difficult enough. In times of crisis, it becomes even more difficult. So it is going to be a huge challenge, and I think the older generation should really encourage the young. The older generation should stop assuming the leadership. In many ways, it has failed. The emphasis has been, as you know, on the older generation, and that's how they came. That's the nature of immigration, to come to America, make a lot of money. Some of them would send it back, some of them would even go back or think of going back, certainly in terms of marriage, maybe even burial, and emphasize law and medicine. How many Muslims have the older generation encouraged the younger generation to become scholars or playwrights or joining the media? Very few. Money was in law and money was in becoming doctors, and therefore we have so many doctors. The Pakistani community has, in this organization called Apna, which is one of the most credible and established organizations in America of Pakistani doctors, something like 12,000 doctors. That's a formidable force. But the primary purpose is you come here, you make lots of money, and you live your very comfortable life in your own cocoon. The young generation needs to begin to change the alignment. America is a country of ideas. Ideas are in contest all the time. Therefore, identity becomes important. And a lot of the ideas are actually being contested on campus. Scholars, in the media, the writers in the media, on television. How many Muslims do you see there? Very few. There are some, but very, very few. Now, I know, Michelle, you are moderating, but this was the last question. I know we're all keen to move on to the Turkish Delight, but I do want to take your permission to just say a few words of gratitude to you for moderating this evening, to my friend Dr. Emre and Jenna for inviting us here, with their usual warm hospitality. And this is on behalf of Zinat, my wife, who's sitting in the back row there. You've treated us with great hospitality. We have brought some very special guests this evening, Michelle. We have Dr. Asad Shah from Pakistan. Nigat, his wife. They are the parents of our wonderful daughter Fatima, sitting in the back row. Dr. Saab, could you just stand up and show yourself? And Nigat? Nigat, where are you? Now, Nigat, no one's going to give you dirty looks because you're wearing the hair. She said people keep looking at me and wondering, and Fatima, of course, sitting next to her. And then, of course, Arshad and Zebu, Zebu has just come from Pakistan. She's been doing heroic work. She and Zeenat had started a program to rehabilitate the refugees in Swat, the victims of the Taliban and the army movement in Swat. And she's just come from Swat with incredible stories of hardship, of people having lost everything, and the challenges the community faces. And she's, of course, someone we not entirely jokingly call the Mother Teresa of the Muslim world. So we're very proud of the work she's doing there. And I believe she had some... So any checks, Emre, my friend, especially from you, because you're the head of such an important institution, would be welcome for the relief aid, the flood victims in Pakistan. So I really want to thank the Rumi Forum for this incredible work that you do in bringing us together, in giving us optimism in this very difficult time.